Something just changed. And if you live anywhere between the Rockies and the Atlantic coast, or even if you're 2,500 miles away in the middle of the Pacific, this next half hour is going to matter to you more than you think. A weather pattern that has been grinding the same handful of states for nearly a week straight is now doing something different. It's moving. It's shifting the bullseye onto brand new territory. And at the exact same time, out in the open ocean near Hawaii, something is building that hasn't happened in over 3 decades. 2 completely different stories, one impossibly active stretch of days, and millions of people who have no idea yet just how much this weekend is about to demand of them. If you want the kind of forecast that actually prepares you instead of just alarming you, hit subscribe right now, because that's the whole reason this channel exists. We don't do panic, we do clarity. And there is a lot of ground to cover today, so let's not waste a single second, because the same stubborn system that has been pounding the middle of the country all week is not done. It's not fading, it's not weakening. It's simply changing its target, and the people standing in that new target zone need to hear this before they walk out the door tomorrow morning. Let's start where the story is actually unfolding right now, because Friday is already in motion. The Storm Prediction Center has drawn its familiar shading across Iowa, Missouri, and yes, once again, Illinois. If that list of states sounds like something you've heard before, that's because you have. This marks somewhere around the 5th or 6th consecutive day these same communities have woken up under a slight risk, or worse. Think about what that actually does to a landscape. It's not just about the storms themselves anymore. It's about what's happening underneath them, because ground that has absorbed days of repeated rainfall behaves completely differently than ground that's dry. We'll come back to why that matters in a big way later, but hold that thought. Wrapping around that core danger zone is a broader marginal risk that stretches from Denver, Colorado, all the way east into Virginia. That is a genuinely massive corridor, and across nearly the entire stretch of it, the primary concern is damaging straight-line wind. Forecasters aren't expecting just one wave of storms to roll through and call it a day. The pattern this week has been 2, sometimes 3 separate rounds firing off in succession, and Friday looks like more of the same relentless rhythm. Large hail is also part of the equation, especially near Denver, with additional chances scattered around Iowa and Missouri. And tucked into the afternoon hours is a low but very real tornado threat focused on Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Davenport. If you're in that stretch of Iowa, this is your reminder, and I mean this seriously. Make sure you have more than one way to receive a warning. A phone alert is good. A weather radio as backup is better. These storms do not send an invitation before they arrive. Now here's where things escalate, because Saturday isn't a pause in the action, it's an expansion of it. The geography of the threat is about to widen considerably. The Storm Prediction Center has carved out 2 separate slight risk zones for Saturday. One sits over Denver, Nebraska, and the western edge of Kansas. The other stretches in a long diagonal line from southern Michigan and Indiana, running all the way down through South Carolina. Connecting those 2 zones is a sprawling marginal risk area that ties nearly the entire eastern half of the map together into one continuous corridor of concern. The headline, "Danger for Saturday," is wind, but not the kind of wind that just rustles a few leaves. We're talking about gusts potentially reaching 60 to 75 miles per hour in the strongest cells. That is the kind of wind that snaps tree limbs clean off, drops power lines across roads, and turns unsecured lawn furniture into genuine projectiles. Large hail returns to the high plains once more, and there's a legitimate chance of a couple of tornadoes forming, with the most likely target zones being Kalamazoo, South Bend, Fort Wayne, and Columbus. That is an enormous amount of population sitting directly underneath this threat, which is exactly why having a redundant way to get warned isn't some overcautious habit. It's just common sense when the setup looks like this. Given how active this stretch is shaping up to be, there's a real possibility of live coverage across multiple days this weekend, so staying subscribed isn't just a nice gesture toward the channel, it's genuinely how you make sure you don't miss the exact moment the sky starts doing something you need to know about. Let's slow the pace down here and actually walk through the timing hour by hour, because understanding that severe weather is coming is one thing, but understanding exactly when it lands on your specific doorstep is what actually keeps you and your family safe. As of this morning, rain is already falling across nearly the entire Midwest. Storms are lined up almost like train cars, stretching from around Des Moines back toward Cincinnati, with a batch of thunderstorms currently pushing through Indianapolis and St. Louis. Each one of these cells is capable of producing an isolated, damaging wind gust on its own. Most of this morning activity is expected to fade out somewhere around lunchtime, and here's the trap. That's exactly the moment people tend to relax and let their guard down. That instinct is precisely backwards, because in the late afternoon, somewhere in that 5 to 6 o'clock window, the atmosphere is forecast to reload completely. An isolated supercellar, too, could fire up north of Kansas City, and those are exactly the storms capable of producing both an isolated tornado and a hail threat simultaneously. Fairly quickly after that, forecasters expect that activity to congeal into a more organized line of thunderstorms. And once that transition happens, damaging wind becomes the dominant threat, especially for folks near Trenton, Kirksville, and the surrounding communities. Follow that line forward through the evening and you can trace exactly where the danger travels next. By around 9 or 10 at night, it's expected to be pushing toward Quincy, Burlington, and even Davenport, still fully capable of producing an isolated tornado alongside scattered, damaging gusts. The line keeps moving into the overnight hours, tracking toward Peoria, before it's finally expected to weaken as it approaches the Chicago area closer to daybreak. Meanwhile, don't lose track of the other half of the country, because back across the Central Plains, Saturday is shaping up to be an entirely separate busy afternoon. Storms are forecast to ignite right along the base of the Rockies, and then roll eastward through Denver, Sterling, and Lamar during the late afternoon and evening hours, packing damaging winds up to that 75-mile-per-hour range, along with isolated pockets of quarter-sized or larger hail. Two very different regions, one relentless, overarching pattern, and the weekend is only just getting started. Now let's talk about the part of this forecast where I want to be completely honest with you about the uncertainty, because that honesty is really the whole point of what we do here. As we move into Saturday, another round of thunderstorms is expected to fire up across the Ohio Valley, and forecasters are genuinely split on how this one evolves. There's a real scenario where this becomes a more organized and dangerous tornado risk stretching across Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And there's an equally plausible scenario where the whole thing simply never gets its act together, fizzling out into nothing more than a weak leftover swirl of energy drifting through with barely any punch behind it. These kinds of marginal borderline setups are some of the hardest situations in all of meteorology to pin down with confidence. And if anyone tells you they know with certainty exactly how this one plays out, they're guessing, not forecasting. What the high-resolution model guidance is currently showing is a small area of rotation developing near Fort Wayne and Toledo during the afternoon hours, with a few rotating supercells possible across Ohio into the late afternoon and early evening. That's part of the reason some of the significant tornado parameters in that zone are ticking upward into a range that would be more than sufficient to support at least a couple of tornadoes, possibly even one tracking near Cincinnati. But in this matters, not every model agrees with that timeline. Other guidance places the rotation potential differently, with some runs suggesting it could begin as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon across northwest Ohio, before expanding through the late evening and into the overnight hours. When the models are disagreeing on both timing and location like this, that disagreement is basically the atmosphere telling you plainly that the answer isn't locked in yet. What does look increasingly likely, even with all that uncertainty, is that some form of tornado threat exists across Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and possibly stretching into northern Kentucky. This is a situation that demands close watching rather than firm promises, which is exactly why a fresh update the following morning becomes essential rather than optional. And that brings me to something I genuinely want to hear from you about, because your local ground-level knowledge matters here more than any model run. If you live anywhere across the Ohio Valley, how many straight days of severe weather threats have you personally dealt with this month? Drop that number in the comments, because the reality on the ground often tells a sharper, more honest story than any map ever could, and I do read every single reply. Let's carry this story forward into Sunday now, because the pattern still isn't finished shifting the danger eastward. Another round of severe weather is expected, and while the exact intensity remains uncertain, the zone to watch is sliding toward Washington, D.C., and Virginia, and even into West Virginia. A corridor is expected to set up running from southern Pennsylvania down toward Virginia Beach, and any supercells that manage to develop along that corridor will be capable of rotating and producing an isolated tornado or two, alongside damaging wind and large hail. So if you've got outdoor plans anywhere in the mid-Atlantic region, particularly from the middle of the afternoon into the early evening, keep one eye on the sky the entire time. As so often happens with this kind of setup, those individual supercells are expected to quickly merge into a broader line of storms, which spreads the damaging wind threat more widely across Delaware, Maryland, and eastern Virginia. Farther west, back across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, a few lingering thunderstorms remain possible on Sunday, but the wind shear that fuels rotation looks considerably weaker in that region by then, so the tornado concern drops significantly. You might see an isolated wind or hail report, maybe a brief spin-up cell, but nothing close to the more organized threat developing further east. Meanwhile, up in New England, a passing area of low pressure looks set to deliver a soaking round of rain from Sunday into early Monday. A much quieter and less dramatic story compared to everything happening farther south and west. But here's the part of this entire setup that I need you to really sit with. Because if I had to point to the single most dangerous element of this whole weekend, it isn't the wind, and it isn't even the tornadoes. It's the water. The Weather Prediction Center has issued a moderate risk of excessive rainfall for the Des Moines and Davenport area, and you need to understand exactly what that label means in practice. A moderate risk sits at level 3 out of 4 on their entire scale. Forecasters do not reach for that kind of language casually or lightly. It is a flashing signal that a serious, potentially life-threatening flooding event is genuinely on the table. We're likely looking at several inches of rain across that region, with isolated spots capable of picking up anywhere from 6 to 12 inches in a single day. And remember what I mentioned earlier about the ground already being pounded by days of repeated storms? That's precisely the piece that turns a heavy rain event into an outright disaster. Saturated soil simply cannot absorb another downpour on top of everything it's already taken in. There's nowhere left for that water to go, so instead it rises, and it rises fast, often faster than people expect. The flooding threat doesn't stop at that one zone either. A slight risk of excessive rainfall stretches from Omaha back toward Roanoke, Virginia, with additional slight risk areas scattered around Denver and even out toward Arizona and Utah, plus a sprawling marginal threat blanketing nearly everyone else across the broader region. But make no mistake, the true bullseye remains exactly where it's been sitting for days now, the Ohio Valley and the Midwest. This region has already endured multiple flash flood emergencies, which, for anyone unfamiliar, is the single most urgent flood alert that exists in the entire warning system. And the most important piece of advice I can give you here is painfully simple. If you come up on a flooded road, turn around. Do not drive through it. It takes shockingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle completely off the road, and more people lose their lives in vehicles during flood events than almost any other single cause. Turn around, don't drown. That phrase exists because people keep ignoring it, and it keeps costing lives every single year. Looking ahead across the next 48 hours, the rainfall totals genuinely become alarming. High-resolution guidance is dumping an enormous amount of rain north of Champaign and over toward Indianapolis, with localized zones potentially seeing 6 to 10 inches of total rainfall. That could very well become the true epicenter of the flooding threat. But once again, the models are arguing with each other. Other guidance shifts the heaviest rain considerably farther west, centering it around and west of Peoria, though even around Peoria itself, 2 to 7 inches remains entirely possible, with similar totals showing up north of Indianapolis in that scenario too. When you line up every available model side by side, you end up with a genuine spread of different possible outcomes. But the through line, the piece that nearly all of them agree on despite their differences, is that the highest totals are most likely to fall somewhere near Davenport and Lafayette. That is your zone of greatest concern this weekend. And if you live anywhere near it, treat every heavy downpour that comes through as a potential emergency, rather than a mere inconvenience you can just wait out. Now, before we look further out across the mainland, we need to travel roughly 2,500 miles out into the open Pacific, because what's happening near Hawaii right now is the kind of event that genuinely stops meteorologists in their tracks. This is Tropical Storm Lala, and as of the latest advisories, it's carrying maximum sustained winds around 60 miles per hour. But the number that actually matters here isn't its current strength, it's its trajectory. Lala is forecast to strengthen and become a hurricane as it approaches the Big Island of Hawaii. And a hurricane warning is already in effect for Hawaii County. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. The last time an actual hurricane made a direct strike on the state of Hawaii was back in 1992. That is more than 3 decades ago. An entire generation of people has grown up on those islands, never once experiencing a direct hurricane hit, largely because the surrounding waters and prevailing winds around Hawaii almost always tear approaching storms apart long before they can arrive at the coastline. Lala is now threatening to break a streak that has held firm for over 30 years, and it's doing it right now in real time. Here's the timeline forecasters are watching closely. The outer bands of Lala are expected to reach the Big Island early Saturday morning, brushing areas like Hilo and Hawaiian Ocean View first. Through the afternoon hours, the storm is projected to make an extremely close approach, and quite possibly an actual landfall, over the southern part of the island near Pahala. Then, into the late evening and overnight hours, it's expected to skirt back offshore while still clipping essentially the entire island chain on its way past. Even the guidance that keeps the storm's center technically offshore only nudges it out by roughly 15 to 25 miles, which is close enough that it barely matters in practical terms. Because whether or not that center technically makes landfall, that the eastern side of the Big Island is still lined up for damaging winds and dangerous storm surge either way. That's really the crucial thing to understand about a storm like this one. The exact landfall point becomes almost a technicality when the impacts spread out so far beyond the storm's actual center. And those impacts are serious. Rainfall totals of 8 to 12 inches are forecast across Maui and the Big Island, with isolated maximum amounts reaching an astonishing 25 inches in spots on the Big Island. 25 inches. That's more than 2 feet of water falling from the sky onto some of the steepest volcanic terrain found anywhere on Earth. On slopes that steep, water doesn't pool gently the way it might on flat ground. It races downhill, gathering speed and debris as it goes, triggering flash floods and mudslides that can bury a road or even a home in a matter of moments. Storm surge is expected to push coastal water levels up noticeably, and peak sustained winds could climb as high as 70 miles per hour in the most exposed areas, particularly around Highway 11 on the southern side of the island. There's an additional hidden danger buried in that wind figure too. On Hawaii's ridges and mountainsides, winds routinely run up to 30% stronger than the surface values you'd see in a standard forecast. That means elevated communities up in those higher terrain areas could end up getting hit even harder than the raw numbers would suggest. You might reasonably be wondering why the Pacific is suddenly spawning an intense tropical system aimed directly at Hawaii, when the mainland has been the main story for weeks now. Part of the answer comes down to the ocean itself. The waters in this particular part of the Pacific are running unusually warm right now, and warm water is essentially the fuel that tropical systems feed on to grow and sustain themselves. A storm that would normally starve and fall apart over cooler seas can instead hold on to its strength, or even intensify further, all the way to the islands. That difference in ocean temperature is genuinely the difference between the streak holding one more time and the streak finally breaking. This weekend, the conditions are tilting firmly in the storm's favor, which raises a sobering point worth sitting with for a moment. For 34 years, Hawaii's protection was never actually a permanent shield built into the geography. It was more like a favorable roll of the dice, repeated over and over year after year. And dice, by their very nature, don't come with guarantees attached. And it isn't only the wind and the rain that officials are watching closely either. With a system like this tracking so close to the islands, emergency managers are also paying attention to the smaller details that often get overlooked in the bigger headlines, things like power infrastructure sitting exposed along coastal roads, agricultural land on the slopes that could see significant erosion, and the simple fact that many of the roads circling these islands only have one practical route in or out of certain communities. If a landslide or flood closes that single route, entire neighborhoods can end up cut off for hours or even longer while crews work to clear the way. That's part of why local officials have been urging residents on the Big Island to treat this storm seriously well before it arrives, rather than waiting to see what the morning brings once the outer bands are already overhead. Emergency shelters are being prepared, and residents in low-lying and slide-prone areas are being encouraged to think through their plans now, while there's still time to act calmly instead of scrambling later. Now let's swing back across to the Atlantic, because the tropical story over there has a second chapter unfolding, and it's moving in a very different direction from Hawaii. Just a day earlier, forecasters were tracking a system with genuinely strong development odds, the kind of angry red and orange blob on the satellite loop that grabs everyone's attention immediately. But the Atlantic has since downgraded its enthusiasm considerably. That feature, sitting out east of the Lesser Antilles, has faded to a much lower chance of formation, somewhere around 30% at this point. And the reason comes down to wind shear. Strong upper-level winds are tearing at the system, preventing it from getting organized, essentially smearing it apart before it ever gets the chance to spin up properly. It's a good reminder that not every disturbance out there turns into a monster storm. Sometimes the atmosphere itself does the job of shutting one down before it ever becomes a real threat. The more interesting candidate to watch is actually the tropical wave, following behind that first system, which has a somewhat better shot at developing into a genuine tropical storm. And if it does manage to organize, it would earn the next name on this year's Atlantic list, Dolly. As for where these two features are headed, the first weaker system looks likely to drift more toward South America, while the second one is expected to track closer to the Lesser Antilles. From there, its future path is genuinely wide open. It really could go in almost any direction from that point forward, which is exactly why this remains a watch and update situation, rather than something you can bank on as a settled forecast today. As these systems continue to evolve over the coming days, staying subscribed is honestly the simplest way to make sure you catch the exact moment the picture sharpens into something clearer, because with tropical systems especially, the difference of a single day can completely change everything about the outcome. So let's zoom back out to the mainland one more time and look at what happens once this brutal, exhausting weekend finally winds down. Because unfortunately, the pattern doesn't just switch itself off once Sunday night arrives. The weather across the United States is expected to stay fairly active, moving into next week. The tricky part right now is pinning down exactly where the next round of severe storms decides to set up. But the northern plains and the Midwest look most likely to remain in the game around Monday and Tuesday, as yet another storm system makes a close pass through the region. That system could touch off another line of thunderstorms across Illinois, Indiana, and even Ohio by Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Beyond that point, the uncertainty grows quickly the further out we push toward the end of August. And honestly, that far out, confidence in any specific detail drops off sharply. But here's a small thought worth holding on to through all of this relentless heat and severe weather we've been living through. We are genuinely not that far from the turn of the seasons now. Fall is only about a month away at this point. If you've been longing for cooler air and quieter, calmer skies, that relief is closer than it feels in the middle of a stretch like this one. That's a small comfort, sure, but sometimes a small comfort is exactly what gets you through a genuinely rough patch of weather like this. Let me pull all of this together now, because when you step back and look at the whole picture, the shape of the story becomes really clear. A single, stubborn weather pattern is doing three enormous things at once, all at the same time. It's firing off day after day of severe thunderstorms along the edge of a sprawling heat dome, threatening damaging winds, hail, and isolated tornadoes across a corridor stretching from the high plains all the way to the mid-Atlantic. It's dumping torrential rain onto ground that's already fully saturated, driving a moderate level 3 out of 4 flash flood risk across parts of Iowa and Illinois in a region that has already declared multiple flood emergencies this week alone. And thousands of miles away, that same restless atmospheric pattern is playing a part in allowing a rare and genuinely dangerous tropical system to close in on Hawaii, threatening to end a 34-year streak in a single weekend. That's the whole reason this forecast keeps coming back to that idea of a storm that shifted and millions of people now finding themselves newly in its path. Because the danger genuinely is moving day by day, from the plains into the Ohio Valley toward the mid-Atlantic and out across the open Pacific all at once. And the people who are newly standing in its way are exactly the ones who most need to be paying close attention right now, today, before the weekend fully arrives. If there's one single message I want you to walk away from this video with, it's that none of these threats deserve to be shrugged off or dismissed. Not the flooding, because water is the quiet killer that ends up taking more lives every single year than wind ever does. Not the tornado risk across the Ohio Valley, uncertain as the exact details still are, because that very uncertainty is precisely why you prepare ahead of time, rather than simply waiting to see what happens. And certainly not Lala, because a streak of good fortune stretching back 34 years is not the same thing as guaranteed safety, and Hawaii is about to be reminded of that distinction in the hardest possible way. The forecasters who fly aircraft directly into these storms, who run these complex models day and night, who issue these warnings under their own name, are not out here crying wolf for attention. They are giving you time. And what you choose to do with that time is really what determines how this entire weekend ends for you and for the people you love. Have more than one way to receive a warning when it's issued. Keep your emergency supplies ready and easy to grab. Know your evacuation route before you actually need it, not after. And when you see water sitting over a road, turn around every single time, no exceptions, no matter how familiar that road usually feels to you. Before you go, tell me one more thing down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious how this pattern is landing wherever you happen to live right now. Are you one of the millions of people who've been living under some kind of weather threat for days on end at this point? Or are you watching all of this unfold from somewhere calm and dry, wondering what all the fuss is about? Your answers genuinely help me understand who's actually sitting in the path of all this, and they shape how I cover the next round of updates as this all continues to develop. This weekend is going to be long and loud across a huge chunk of the country, and the situation building near Hawaii could realistically change hour by hour as new data comes in. So the single most useful thing you can do right now is stay informed, rather than get caught off guard and surprised later. That's exactly what we're here for, cutting through the noise to give you clear, honest weather coverage that you can actually use, backed by real data and real science, with none of the fear-mongering that so much of the internet leans on these days. If this breakdown helped you make sense of a genuinely chaotic few days ahead, do me a quick favor and hit that like button, because it honestly helps more people find this video in time to actually prepare instead of finding it after the fact. Subscribe so the next update lands right in your feed the moment things change out there, and drop that comment below so we can keep this conversation going together. Stay weather aware, look out for your neighbors, and I'll see you in the very next forecast. Take care of yourselves out there,